기후변화 대응과 관련해 예상되는 가장 현실적인 어려움 중 하나는 바로 경제일 것입니다. 그러한 관점에서 친환경과 경제 성장, 이 두 가지 목표를 다 이룰 수 있는 방법으로 주목받고 있는 것이 있는데요. 바로 그린 뉴딜입니다. 세계적 경제 석학이자 지속가능 발전 분야의 최고 권위자인 제프리 삭스 컬럼비아대 교수님과 그리고 홍종호 서울대 환경대학원 교수님의 대담을 통해 환경과 경제 그리고 그린 뉴딜에 대한 예리한 통찰을 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
Professor Sachs, you are well known to have academic excellence, becoming a tenured professor at the age of only 28 at the economics department of Harvard University. Then you pursued and participated in global issues facing humanity, including economic growth of former socialist nations, poverty in Africa, global sustainability, and climate change. So my first question is, can you tell a little bit about your background? What made you become deeply involved in real-life issues and dedicate to bringing about real change?
Thank you so much for a nice question. My father was a lawyer, a constitutional expert in the United States. He represented workers who faced hardships, and I watched him and was very inspired by his commitment to social justice. And when I was just starting university, I was fascinated by the questions of what would make for social justice and for a good society. I had the chance to visit just after my high school graduation, a pen pal in East Berlin, which was, of course, the communist East Berlin at the time. So this was a very surprising, really shocking experience for me. And I came to Harvard University as a student, deciding that I would study social choices and economics to try to understand these issues. Well, that was actually 49 years ago, so I've been at this for a long time, but I never lost interest in the central question. How do we make for a good society and a prosperous life? How can we ensure social justice? So what I learned from my father, what I learned from my experience as a young person, what I learned as a student, I was fortunate to be able to continue throughout my entire professional career. And always, whether as professor at Harvard University or now as professor at Columbia University, for the 40 years that I've been a professor, I've always had the strong support of my institutions to be engaged in real problem solving on real issues.
So your father had much influence on you during your teenage years?
Yes, absolutely. I watched him in court, in the US Supreme Court, arguing cases on behalf of trade unions and on behalf of people in need. It was, of course, he made a very deep impression, always emphasizing that we need justice and we need fairness in society. I think this is a basic point which I very much try to honor in my work, which is that the world really should work for everybody, for the downtrodden, for the poor, for people that are in need, whether they're in need of healthcare or in need of the skills and education or livelihoods. We should organize our societies and now the whole world community to ensure that those basic needs, sometimes considered, and I think rightly, economic rights, can be achieved by everybody.
You know, economists tend to focus on efficiency issues rather than equity. So I think young economists who are students of economics should learn more from you. Yes.
You know, efficiency is fine and it's important. We shouldn't waste. But on the other hand, this is a rich world in which people still suffer from massive deprivation. And so what impresses me about our society globally is we have so much wealth, so much scientific knowledge, so much technological capacity, and yet still 1 billion people struggle for survival because they're so poor. This is not right, and it is solvable. And so I also believe that economics can be a very practical set of tools. In other words, it's not only a theoretical science, it is a professional practice that has the ethical responsibility to help make the world better.
You have spent more than 30 years speaking about and trying to solve the seriousness of global poverty, as you just said, and the importance of sustainable development. Looking back at this point, do you think humanity is more socioeconomically sustainable than it was 30 years ago? Or do you have a gloomy outlook when considering the increase in global income inequality and climate change?
Well, I don't think we should ever have the luxury of a gloomy outlook. We need to always be looking for solutions. And I do think that if we compare the situation, say, in 1990 with the situation in 2020, when it comes to poverty, there's a huge improvement. The rate of extreme poverty has come down a lot. Of course, we're battling with COVID right now, so we had 30 years of progress and 1 year that has been a hard shock. But we've seen a tremendous amount of progress in all parts of the world, most dramatically, of course, in East Asia with China ending extreme poverty, having been extraordinarily impoverished 40 years ago. This is good news. But it's not only China. Of course, Korea is one of the great success stories of history in Korea's economic successes. Throughout Asia, there is remarkable improvement of living standards compared to 1 or 2 generations ago. And in Africa, which remains the poorest part of the world, there is significant progress. Poverty is coming down. I've watched that with my own eyes for 30 years of very active engagement and visiting and seeing with my own eyes what a difference it makes to have the internet, to have mobile telephony, to have the technologies that we now have for stopping diseases, for better healthcare, for online education, for electronic payments, for renewable energy. All of this is very empowering. And it means that my idea, which I wrote about in 2005, that we can and should end poverty on this planet is realistic. I wish we worked harder at it. I wish my own country were a bit more generous internationally, but we can end extreme poverty, and I believe that it remains a paramount goal for global society.
The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed the global economy into an unprecedented crisis in 2020. Scientists argue that zoonosis and vector-borne diseases are not irrelevant to climate change. I understand that you have been researching and working in the field to fight malaria for a long time. What are your views on the relationship between the disease crisis, the economic crisis, and the climate crisis? Do you think there is a solution to this, to solve the 3 things at the same time?
We have known for quite a long time that the environmental disruptions are giving rise to more disease threats. So when we have zoonoses like SARS or COVID-19 or mirrors. People will recall, of course, Korea faced that challenge in a very harsh way. H1N1. These all involve not only a new disease, but also environmental change that is spreading these diseases or making humans come into contact with the viruses or the other animal populations that cause the transmission of these diseases. It's part of the overall environmental upheaval. And scientists have been warning we're going to have more and more of these emerging diseases unless we are more sustainable in our environmental management. And we're going to have to pay attention that these diseases are coming more frequently, so we also have to prepare to be ready for them. Now, in this case, Korea responded very well. Of course, there were disruptions in Korea, as in all parts of the world, but the response in Korea was so much better than the response in the United States. The deaths were kept at a very low level. The transmission of the virus was kept at a low level. The public health officials worked to stop outbreaks of the disease. In my country, they didn't do anything for a year. We had more than 500,000 deaths. Till today, it's more than 560,000 deaths, if you can imagine how bad the response has been. So I've been saying for more than a year, learn from Korea, learn from what the Asian countries are doing, because it's China, it's Korea, Japan has done relatively well, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Vietnam, Laos, Australia, New Zealand. The Asia Pacific region has had a strong response because preparedness was high. The government acted in an effective manner. The public was very responsible. In my country, the preparedness was very low. The government was completely irresponsible, and the public didn't listen anyway. And so the end result is that the disease spread much faster, farther, and with many, many more deaths. It shows we have to be more serious in governance. And I really applaud Korea for what it has accomplished and what it has demonstrated about what effective responses can mean to keep things better. And it didn't come at a big economic cost. On the contrary, it reduced the economic upheaval that we experienced in the US.
Thank you for saying nice words for Korean governments and Korean citizens, people's efforts. But as you might know, we still have our own problem as well. Like, for instance, the vaccination, it's very slow. So that might prolong the economic difficulties.
I think that this is an interesting point and worth mentioning. When the outbreak first occurred, back in January 2020, the Korean businesses and scientists were very alert, and within a month, test kits were made, and the testing began, and effective control measures were taken very early. But interestingly, Korea did not start vaccination work in terms of developing vaccines domestically. So the vaccines primarily have been developed in the United States, in some countries in Europe, in Russia, and in China. And Korea is so good technologically on so many different areas that I would expect now the Korean public health strategy will include building up Korea's ability to produce vaccines, indeed these cutting-edge mRNA vaccines, as part of public policy going forward. Because my experience knowing Korea and watching Korea over a 40-year period is that it will take an event like this next time, and there will be a next time, unfortunately. I bet Korea will be one of the first countries to have a vaccine ready and new drugs. So I think this is a learning experience.
Let me turn my question to the U.S., your country. The Biden administration, they came up with a $2.25 trillion of economic recovery plan. Beyond traditional infrastructure such as roads and bridges, this new plan proposes new infrastructure investment strategies such as power grids, water systems, digital infrastructure, and EV charging stations. In particular, it emphasizes that this is a response to climate change risks. What is your opinion on this government-driven public investment strategy that the Biden administration is pursuing?
I very much support what the administration is proposing, and it's long overdue. The United States politically has been divided over climate change because we have many parts of the country that produce fossil fuels. And so the oil companies are quite powerful politically. Even the coal companies, until recently, were politically quite powerful. The Republican Party, Trump's party, was opposed to climate action. But even when the Democrats had office earlier during the Obama period, while he wanted to take climate action, he could not get the votes in Congress. So the United States has delayed on this issue for a long time, mainly for domestic political reasons. The power of the coal, oil, and natural gas lobbies and interests, and the geographic interests of those states that produce the fossil fuels, like Texas or Louisiana or Wyoming or North Dakota or West Virginia, that have delayed climate action. Well, now the situation's very, very serious. Everybody understands we're in a climate disaster already. We're in a serious climate crisis. That's why Korea has adopted a plan to decarbonize by 2050. The United States under Biden is finally adopting that strategy. Prime Minister Suga of Japan has similarly adopted such a plan. The European Green Deal similarly has adopted decarbonization by 2050. And of course, China has announced that it would decarbonize no later than 2060. And I would like them to announce 2050 as the target date as well. So I think we're finally getting serious on this. All of the major countries, it's so important. It's been long delayed, but it's finally coming. And I strongly support what President Biden is calling for when he is now exercising responsibility. He's undoing a lot of the damage of his predecessor, Donald Trump, who was in favor of the fossil fuel lobby and thought politically that that lobby would help him. So he was very bad on this issue, but President Biden is very good on the issue.
So if you were an economic advisor to President Biden at this moment, what kind of advice would you give him regarding tackling climate change and a fast recovery from COVID-19?
Well, I give him advice even though I'm not an advisor, because I write lots of op-eds and of course have many, many close colleagues and friends and students in the Biden administration. So I speak quite frequently with the senior government officials. I like the path that they're on. Decarbonize by 2050, create a strategy, put it into legislation, back it up with funding to invest in a zero carbon power system, to electrify vehicles, because we will be an electric vehicle world very soon, to create a hydrogen economy for parts of heavy industry. this is the path that we need to be on. And I'm quite confident that this is the direction that this administration wants to go. Because of the political lobbying, the division, the close votes in Congress, nothing is sure. But I know that the leadership of the administration certainly wants to move in this direction and move quickly in this direction.
Thank you. Human efforts to respond to climate change can be divided into mitigation policy and adaptation policy, as you would know. How much would you give if you were to grade the global greenhouse gas reduction policy that has entered the UN over the last 30 years? As you know, governments have no choice but to carry out numerous policies with limited resources. Which do you think should be more prioritized, mitigation or adaptation, especially in the developing countries, in pursuing climate change policies?
Of course, officially, the world is committed to doing both, and even financially to dividing it roughly 50-50 in terms of emphasis. But I would emphasize we must focus on the mitigation, because if the climate continues to warm as dramatically as it has been, we won't be able to adapt. The shocks and the disruptions will be so large, they will overwhelm our capacity globally to respond politically and to respond in a humane way. For example, if we warm in this reckless way that we've been going for the last 30 years, the possibility of a multi-meter rise of sea level becomes quite realistic, and that would be devastating for hundreds of millions of people around the world. The extreme storms, the floods, the droughts, the heat waves, the forest fires would be not manageable. So we have to decarbonize by mid-century. We have to succeed with the Korean Green Deal, with the Japan Green Deal, with the European Green Deal, with the new US Green Deal under President Biden. We must succeed on this, because even then we're going to have to adapt, because the climate will continue to be disrupted, but at least it won't get out of control. And this is the main point that must be emphasized. Some people say, why should we spend so much to decarbonize the energy system and so forth? But they don't understand how dangerous the trajectory of uncontrolled climate change would be for humanity.
Right. Speaking of sea level rise that you just mentioned, where you reside in, I assume New York City might not be free from that, the danger of sea level rise in the future. I don't know when that will be.
Well, I live on a small island economy. It's called Manhattan, New York City. It is an island, and we are surrounded by water. And the risks of rising sea levels are already very clear. We had a disastrous hurricane hit in 2012, Hurricane Sandy, sometimes called Superstorm Sandy, that caused tens of billions of dollars of damage. And we're still, 9 years later, still recovering in some parts of the New York region from that storm, because it created so much havoc and disruption. And the city is building billions of dollars of protection against these storm surges and risks of flooding, but we haven't accomplished that kind of protection yet, and therefore we're at risk even with the current sea level rise. But what the scientists, of course, are warning about is that we could reach a serious disintegration of part of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which would lead to several meters of sea level rise. Nobody knows the timing, maybe some decades, maybe a century, but the likelihood is very real if the warming continues on the trajectory that it has been on, warming by about 0.2 degrees Celsius every decade. And now maybe even faster, maybe 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. This is very, very dangerous.
All right. Let's come back to the Korean situation. The Korean government declared, you mentioned that as well, 2050 carbon neutrality at the end of last year, and is pushing various policies to realize it. However, the proportion of renewable energy generation in Korea is only 6%. It's astonishingly low. And this remains at the bottom of the OECD list. I would think you will probably agree that efforts to expand renewable energy are one of the most active policies to respond to climate change. What suggestions would you have for Korean government and citizens from the perspective of having looked at energy transition policies of many countries, including your country, US, and the EU?
I think the most important point is that all of the transition paths that I've studied are basically the same, that the power sector should produce electricity even more than now, but without carbon emissions. That's number one. Transport should be electrified. We need to move to electric vehicles. That's number two. Our buildings should be heated and our cooking should be largely with electricity, with heat pumps and other technologies. And our industry, for example, steel making, should shift from using carbon to shifting to hydrogen, for example, which a number of major steel makers are now exploring and testing. So this is the basic pathway, but for Korea, the challenge is what power source can generate the zero carbon power. Nuclear will play some role for sure, because Korea will have nuclear power plants, and this will provide some of the power. Solar can provide some, though Korea is not the sunniest place in the world. It has some capacity, not so much land for that also. Offshore wind will be promising because Korea has the ability to tap a lot of offshore wind, and the price of offshore wind is plummeting worldwide. This is going to be a big part of the solution for the US Northeast, where I live. And it wasn't expected 5 or 10 years ago, but there's a massive investment in offshore wind taking place because the costs have come down so dramatically. Then I would explore to what extent can Korea benefit from connections with the neighbors, with China, with Japan, with the rest of Asia in an interconnected energy system strategy. You know, countries for national security want to have their own power system to an extent that's very important. But we know that when it comes to renewable energy, a large continental scale interconnection can make a lot of sense because it's windy one place, maybe it's not windy in another place, where the sun is shining one place, maybe it's cloudy in another place. So by spreading a long interconnected grid, there is a better chance to tap the renewable energy. And I'm a believer in regional cooperation. Of course, for Korea, this is a tricky matter. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do think that one should look at the possibilities of regional cooperation. Even on the Korean Peninsula, possibly with hydroelectric power and so on. Of course, politics and geopolitics is very, very complicated in your region. But I do hope that regional cooperation could help to address the puzzle. What I would emphasize, though, is one basic point, and that is that Korea's economic success and prosperity for the last really 60 years of economic development have come from being technologically very creative and very dynamic. And Korea built from poverty many of the world's leading technology companies. I would like to see Korea become a leader in renewable energy technologies, in photovoltaics, in wind, in smart grids, because Korea is a leader in 5G and in artificial intelligence and other digital technologies. And so I think, and of course in automobiles, because I expect that we're going to be driving Korea's electric vehicles in the future. So I would say to Korea's great engineers, go at it, go for it. This is also going to be part of Korea's export success in the future, this technological leadership in the zero carbon economy.
You mentioned interconnected grid system within the East Asia region. And I just checked the numbers. Japan, their renewable energy proportion is around 20%. China is getting close to that. Korea, on the other hand, is less than 10%. So I think Korean government and Korean people as a whole should really work more hard trying to improve on this proportion, that we can do it as well, like other countries in this region.
One thing that's very important, and you know it very well, is the role that academics can play in showing what the options are. And so now that the Korean government has made very clear we must decarbonize by 2050, I would like to see plans, 5 or 6 alternative strategies of how this can be done, and to study their alternative costs, their national security implications, and so forth, but to show actual pathways. We did this in the US. I and a group of academics around the United States got together and spent several months online last year working on a joint plan, which we call the Zero Carbon Action Plan. And it is a detailed scenario of how the United States can get to net zero by 2050. And there are 6 or 7 core scenarios. Some use nuclear power, others don't. Some rely on carbon capture and storage, others don't. In other words, you can choose and analyze which work better, which are trade-offs that Korea would accept. But it's extremely important to make scenarios to show how this can be done, and then to have the public debate and expert deliberation to choose the ones that make the most sense. What doesn't work is only to announce a goal and somehow hope that it's going to work out right. The key need is to design detailed scenarios of how this can be achieved.
Yeah, I like your point. Academics, we have to make scenarios, alternative scenarios, and then we have to talk about it. We have to have communication with the public, deliberation process. Yeah, I think that's very important.
Deliberation is very important because people need to understand better than they do. What are the real choices? Why would the government make this promise? Could we achieve it? And I think when one looks at the options, they're better than people expect, because we have in the United States a lot of conservative opinion that says it's too expensive, you can never do it. But we showed very clearly how it can be done and showed the costs of doing it based on explicit costs of the various technologies. And lo and behold, it's not expensive and it can really be accomplished. So I think this is extremely important to help the whole society to choose the path forward.
That's very encouraging to hear. The seriousness of the climate change is bringing huge changes to decision-making in government and businesses. The EU is pursuing a plastic tax already this year. and a carbon border tax beginning 2023, I believe. And the US government is also considering policies for decarbonization, as you said. Global companies in the business sector are declaring a renewable energy only so-called RE100. ESG investment and management are becoming mainstream in the financial market as well. The Korean economy has strengths in IT sectors such as semiconductors, but carbon-based energy-intensive industries such as steel and petrochemicals are still our main industries. How would climate change policies and actions of governments and companies around the world affect the carbon competitiveness of Korean industries and companies in the global market? How soon do you think the pressure on decarbonization in the global market will become a reality for Korean economy and Korean industries?
I think that for the basic sectors, moving to low carbon electricity, moving to electric vehicles, moving to electrification of buildings, this is going to happen quite quickly. I would say to the Korean automotive companies, do not expect to sell internal combustion engine vehicles in the 2030s. We're seeing every big company right now, Volkswagen, General Motors, and others, and of course in China, many companies, now competing with Tesla, because Tesla became so valuable in the stock market, but also everybody realizing this is the way things are going to move. When it comes to some of the other key sectors where the technology choices are harder, steel is a good example. Aviation is another example, not a sector that Korea is key to, but shipping, for example, also needs decarbonization, and Korea remains a major country in shipbuilding. There, I think moving very deliberately forward with prototypes, with research and development, with plans for decarbonization, I think is very important for the future of the industry, not because this will change from one year to the next, but I know I was yesterday speaking with a major CEO in Europe who was taking on a new assignment of a zero carbon steel mill that one of the European companies is going to be prototyping, because they know that's the future. And so I would say for Korea's steel industry, absolutely be serious about this. In Europe, they were looking at the hydrogen route for hydrogen-based steel production, which is a promising technology. There are others also that are under consideration. But I think that Korea excels at engineering and innovation. And Korea is about at the top of the world chart of the share of national income devoted to research and development. This is the great competitive strength of Korea. Also, the education system is so strong that young people really learn science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and that's why the scores are so high. So please stay on that direction, because in the age of technological change, this will be the key to competitive advantage, and I think Korea is very well placed for that.
Okay. Well, POSCO, which is the largest steel manufacturing company in Korea, they announced 2050 carbon neutrality. So they should take your advice more seriously and try to make that happen.
It gives me confidence, because they're such a major company that when they announce that they're going to achieve it, I'm confident. And one of the things that is happening, of course, in East Asia is the development of a very vigorous hydrogen economy. Japan and Australia have been working on cooperation on the hydrogen economy. I know of some other new ventures that are likely to go forward. involving countries in the Asia Pacific to build a regional hydrogen economy. And again, this is an area where Korea could play a significant role.
The greenhouse gas mitigation policy can be considered the most important strategy for responding to climate change. Economists propose a carbon tax, as you well know, and emission trading system as major policy measures that can be used to reduce the use of fossil fuel. Currently, the EU and South Korea are implementing an emission trading system for carbon mitigation. EU for the last 15 years, Korea for the last 5 years. On the other hand, many countries around the world have introduced and implemented carbon tax policy. Which of the two policies, as an economist, do you think is the more effective for carbon mitigation? What is your reason, and what do you think is the biggest obstacle in actually implementing a certain policy, for that matter?
I actually think that the combination of regulation, so announcing by certain dates that certain transformations should be required of business, combined with clear tax policies in the future that rise over time so that businesses can expect that while the tax is very low now, by 2030 it's going to be higher, and by 2035 they don't want to pay because they ought to already be decarbonized. And state-supported research and development in public-private technology ventures. And then finally, public investments in green infrastructure. For example, charging stations for and charging sites for electric vehicles, or fast rail, or other public investments, is a package. No one tool by itself will be sufficient. I'm impressed with the carbon trading system because it is a bit cumbersome. It's hard to know how to set the boundaries. It doesn't give a clear signal for 5 or 10 or 15 years onward. And so if I had to choose between carbon tax and trading system, I would go with the carbon tax as more clear, more transparent, but I would basically make the tax rise over time, predictably, so that it could start low now, but in 5 or 10 years, much higher, so that when companies ask about their new investments, not their current operations, but their new investments, they say, we better go green because the tax is going to be quite high in 10 or 15 or 20 years, and we don't want to pay it at that point. So it's really the combination of the infrastructure, the R&D policy, the regulatory framework, and the tax policy that together, I think, creates the incentive structure for business.
So you're saying a clear signal to the industry from the government that the carbon tax, whatever we call it, energy tax, it will be increasing in the future. So you should be prepared for that.
That's right. And don't think that you're going to get away with one more round of investment in fossil fuel-based infrastructure. You'll probably have to scrap it because it won't be feasible or profitable 15 years from now. So every time you're making a new investment in capacity, think green. That's what I would emphasize.
The climate crisis is stirring changes in all areas of the world, including policies, economy, finance, and society. Many young people, like the environmental activist Greta Thunberg, argue that older generations, like you and me, decisions should be changed. However, the issue of climate change for people in Korea does not have a high priority of urgency and importance than existing socio-economic issues such as economic growth, income and wealth inequality, low birth rate, and the aging population. politicians also very passive in making climate change a major agenda. That's what's happening in Korea, unfortunately. Social acceptance of solar and wind energy is low, and location conflicts surrounding renewable energy, especially in rural areas, are rampant. As a global leader in sustainable development, what would you say about the situation in Korea? I'm sure you have visited many places, many developing countries, and you have might have witnessed all these problems in those countries. So I please, some honest opinion about this. This is my last question, in fact.
Well, one thing for us in our responsibility is education. And so I want young people to be empowered with the knowledge, technical knowledge and biophysical knowledge to understand why this issue is so important, and to be empowered with the skills, whether in engineering or in our fields in economics, what to do so that they can be effective leaders of the transformation. It's true that we wasted a lot of time, unfortunately, and made it harder and have incurred a lot of warming already to this point, 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial temperature. So very serious warming already has occurred while we've talked rather than acted. But I think that people, in my experience, are coming to understand why this is so important, because the danger signs are everywhere around us. The natural disasters are spreading, the extreme storms, the floods and the droughts and the forest fires are becoming more and more devastating. And so in the United States, we were very slow to react. Now people get it. And I'm sure that in Korea, when the government announced decarbonization by 2050, people could understand that is really important, and why the government is joining Japan, China, the United States, the European Union, United Kingdom, and other countries in this effort. I think for Korea also, which has been so good at spotting future trends in the world economy, because I remember visiting Samsung 30 years ago.
30 years ago, wow.
Yes, watching it develop into this global leader. It saw the future, how we were going digital, the areas that it would become a world leader in. And I think for Korean people, it's not only the transformation at home, but it is Korea's role as a technology leader to anticipate the market developments. And here, the future markets will be green technologies, because it's needed. It's needed all over the world. Think of China, your giant neighbor and market next door, decarbonizing. That's a huge trillions of dollars of effort over the next years. And I'm sure that Korean industry will be very important and very helpful in that. Think of Korean exports of automobiles, as I've mentioned on several occasions. They have to be competitive electric vehicles in the future. So in this sense, Korea will play many roles, not only as protecting Korea's own environment and reducing Korea's own emissions, but as a technology leader, providing the kinds of green technologies that the world will be asking for in the coming years.
So if you allow me to summarize your final remarks, if the Korean government can provide the right signal, the consistent signal to the industry, to the investors, to the consumers, then Korean economy can move forward to decarbonized economy and the society as well.
I'm sure that that is correct. And also be a leader to help other countries do the same,
Right.
with a good export market resulting from that.
Thank you, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, for having time with myself and the Korean Times Korea Forum for a long time online. It's been very fruitful, and your comments, your thoughts would provide much help, much insight to what we should do.
Such a pleasure to be with you, and such an honor for me to be part of the Korea Forum. It's a great gathering. The national leaders, the scientific experts, and leaders across society. So thank you for having me, and thank you for Korea's leadership. The example that Korea sets and the contributions that Korea makes to the world are so important. And so it's a pleasure for me to be at the Korea Forum.